The story of the British Empire's decline is not one of sudden collapse, but rather a slow, inexorable erosion of power that took place over more than a century. At its peak during the 19th century, Britain stood as the undisputed master of the world. No nation possessed such industrial might, no fleet could challenge its naval supremacy, and no currency carried more weight in global commerce than the British pound. Yet, by the middle of the 20th century, this mighty empire had fragmented into independent nations, its industries had lost their competitive edge, and the financial system it had built had been replaced by that of its former ally, the United States. Understanding how this transformation occurred requires us to examine not just the military and political events that reshaped the world, but the economic forces that ultimately determined who held power and who did not. In the early years of the 19th century, Britain found itself in an extraordinary position. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in British soil, had transformed the nation into the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Factories proliferated across England, Scotland, and Wales, producing textiles, steel, coal, and machinery at unprecedented scales. While other nations were still predominantly agricultural societies, Britain was rapidly becoming an urban industrial giant. This manufacturing prowess gave Britain what historians often call the position of the workshop of the world. Goods bearing the Made in Britain label were coveted globally. British textile mills produced cloth cheaper and of better quality than anywhere else on Earth. British steel built railroads and ships worldwide. British mining operations extracted resources from across the globe, and British engineers designed the machines that other nations depended upon. This industrial dominance was not accidental. It resulted from a confluence of historical circumstances and deliberate policies. Britain possessed abundant coal deposits that powered its factories. It had developed sophisticated banking and credit systems that financed industrial expansion. Most crucially, Britain had built the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. This navy was not merely a military force, it was the backbone of British commercial supremacy. With command of the seas, Britain could protect its merchant fleets, enforce trade agreements, and prevent rivals from accessing distant markets. The British Navy enabled British merchants to establish trading posts and eventually territorial control across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The empire that followed served not just as a source of national pride, but as an economic necessity, a vast market for British manufactured goods, and a source of raw materials that kept British factories supplied and competitive. The 19th century witnessed Britain's growing financial hegemony as well. London became the centre of global finance. The city of London, with its banks, insurance companies, and merchant houses, orchestrated the flow of capital around the world. The British pound sterling evolved into the currency of choice for international transactions. When merchants in distant lands needed to conduct trade with one another, they often did so in pound sterling. When nations sought to borrow money to develop infrastructure or finance wars, they turned to London banks. This financial dominance was intimately connected to Britain's naval power and manufacturing might. Because Britain controlled the seas, it could enforce contracts and protect investments. Because Britain produced goods the world wanted, British merchants accumulated wealth that they lent out at advantageous terms. The pound, backed by this combination of military power, industrial capacity, and accumulated wealth, became what we might call the first global reserve currency. The zenith of British power came around the middle of the 19th century. The Great Exhibition of 1,851 inches. London showcased British technological achievement and announced to the world Britain's supremacy. Queen Victoria ruled over an empire that stretched across continents. British governors administered India, which provided both troops for the empire's armies and markets for British goods. British colonies dotted the map of Africa and the Pacific. In the minds of British leaders and much of the British public, this was a natural order. Britain was destined to lead the world because it possessed the culture, the values, and the capabilities to do so. Yet within this moment of triumph lay the seeds of decline. The very technologies that had given Britain its industrial advantage were beginning to spread to other nations. German industrialists learned British techniques and began building factories of their own. American entrepreneurs developed their own innovations and built industrial capacity that eventually surpassed Britain's. By the late 19th century, the United States and Germany were producing more steel than Britain. Their factories were newer and often more efficient. The competitive advantage that Britain had enjoyed was gradually slipping away. Other nations were no longer merely consumers of British goods. they were becoming producers themselves, and in some cases, producing cheaper and better goods. The response of British leaders to this challenge was complex. Some called for protective tariffs to shield British industry from foreign competition. Others advocated for maintaining free trade and believing that Britain's efficiency would guarantee its dominance. What united most of them was a determination to hold on to the empire and the system of imperial preference that allowed Britain preferential access to colonial markets and resources. Investment in the empire became a way to compensate for fading industrial supremacy. If British manufacturers could no longer dominate global markets through superior efficiency, perhaps they could dominate through controlled markets, their captive colonial markets. The empire, which had once been a natural extension of British commercial success, became increasingly important as a prop for flagging competitiveness. But the late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw the emergence of new powers that challenged Britain's dominance. The German Empire, unified in 1871, embarked on rapid industrialization and began building a fleet to challenge British naval supremacy. The United States, having consolidated its territory and recovered from civil war, turned its enormous resources toward industrial and commercial expansion. Russia, despite its backwardness, remained a vast territorial power with significant resources and military capacity. Japan, having undergone its own modernization in the Meiji period, began expanding its influence in East Asia. These rising powers viewed the world of British global dominance with envy and resentment. They saw colonies as prizes to be won and markets to be conquered. The peaceful world order that Britain had maintained through its naval and economic power began to fragment into competing spheres of influence and zones of conflict. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the first major blow to British power, though few recognised it at the time. Britain entered the war as the most powerful nation on earth, and it emerged as one of the victors. Yet the war had fundamentally altered the distribution of global wealth and power. Britain had mortgaged its future to finance the war effort. It borrowed enormous sums, particularly from the United States. British factories, once the producers of consumer goods and industrial equipment, were converted to producing weapons and ammunition. Young British men, who might have become engineers, entrepreneurs, and factory workers, were sent to the trenches where millions were killed or wounded. The Empire's military forces were stretched thin across multiple theatres of war. Soldiers from British colonies, who had been sent to fight Britain's war, returned home with new political consciousness and a desire for independence. The financial toll of World War I was particularly devastating to Britain's position. The war cost Britain more than it could afford. To pay for it, Britain sold off foreign investments, liquidated assets, and borrowed heavily. After the war, Britain found itself heavily indebted, its industrial base depleted, and its young population decimated. The United States, by contrast, had entered the war late and fought on its own territory. American industry had thrived during the war, producing weapons and supplies not just for American forces but for British and French forces as well. American banks had made enormous profits lending to the Allies. By 1918, the United States had shifted from being a debtor nation to being a creditor nation. American wealth, once concentrated in the hands of industrial magnates, had become political power. The financial centre of the world was beginning to shift from London to New York. The interwar period witnessed Britain's futile attempts to restore its pre-war position. In 1925, Britain made the fateful decision to return the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war parity. This decision, championed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, was meant to restore Britain's position as the centre of global finance and affirm the pound's status as a world currency. Yet it was based on a miscalculation. The pound was overvalued at this rate, which made British exports more expensive on world markets and British imports cheaper. British manufacturers found it harder to compete internationally. Unemployment rose in Britain, particularly in industrial regions. The decision to return to gold at the pre-war rate was meant to restore confidence in the pound, but it actually accelerated Britain's industrial decline by making British goods uncompetitive. Meanwhile, the British Empire itself was beginning to fracture politically. In India, nationalist movements gained momentum as educated Indians who had served in the war or studied abroad began demanding independence. In Ireland, a war of independence had been fought in the years after World War I, and the Irish Free State had been established. In other colonies, nationalist movements were stirring. The Great Depression of the 1930 further weakened Britain's economic position and strengthened the forces demanding independence. Colonial populations that had been willing to accept British rule when it seemed to bring prosperity and order became restless when it brought economic hardship and offered no path to self-determination. The rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler in the 1930s presented Britain with an increasingly stark challenge. Germany, having been crushed in World War I and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilt its military and industrial power with ruthless efficiency. German rearmament violated the treaties that had ended World War I, but Britain, weakened by economic depression and war debt, had limited options to respond. Britain attempted to manage the threat through diplomacy and even signed a naval agreement with Germany, hoping to contain German expansion. Yet Hitler's ambitions were not containable. The invasion of Poland in 1939 finally forced Britain into a confrontation it was not economically prepared for. World War II delivered the final blow to British power, though this too was not immediately apparent. Once again, Britain was forced to devote its entire economy to the war effort. Factories that might have produced goods for export were converted to military production. Soldiers once again died in tremendous numbers. The war was fought on a scale unprecedented in human history, consuming resources at a rate that was simply beyond Britain's capacity to sustain indefinitely. Britain survived only through American assistance. The United States, again entering the war late, provided Britain with weapons, supplies, and financial support through the Lend-Lease program and subsequent loans. By the end of the war, Britain was utterly dependent on American support and heavily indebted to the United States. The war had also altered the global balance of power in more fundamental ways. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany, emerged as a superpower. The United States, having suffered relatively light casualties on its own territory, emerged with its industrial base intact and its economy booming. Germany and Japan had been defeated, but they had been defeated by the two nations that were least damaged by the war, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, by contrast, had fought for the entire length of the war, had lost millions of its young men, and had exhausted its resources. The notion that Britain could be the world's leading power was no longer tenable. The immediate post-war period saw the final dissolution of the British Empire. Indian independence came in 1947, marking the loss of the jewel in the imperial crown. Independence movements across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, emboldened by the weakness of Britain and the explicit opposition to colonialism from both the United States and the Soviet Union, successfully pressed for independence. By the early 1960s, the vast empire on which the sun never set had been reduced to a collection of small territories and the loose association of nations known as the Commonwealth. The colonies that had once provided Britain with resources and markets for its manufactures were now independent nations, often more inclined to trade with their neighbours or with the United States than with Britain. The loss of the empire meant the loss of the economic system that had sustained Britain's power. The privileged access to colonial markets disappeared. The resources that had flowed to Britain from around the world now had to be purchased on competitive world markets. British industry, which had declined during the war, found itself unable to compete in the post-war world. American and European manufacturers produced better goods more efficiently. Japanese manufacturers, starting from a position of devastation after the war, rebuilt their industries using the latest technology and became formidable competitors. British goods that had once dominated world markets found themselves struggling to maintain market share. British industry stagnated while other nations' industries surged forward. The financial system that Britain had built also crumbled in the post-war years. The pound sterling, though still used in international commerce, was no longer the dominant reserve currency. The United States, with its enormous economic power, and the dollar backed by American gold, reserves, became the centre of a new monetary order. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the Western nations had agreed to a new international monetary system based on the dollar and the gold standard. This system effectively made the dollar, not the pound, the world's reserve currency. London's role as the centre of global finance was supplanted by New York. British banks, once the arbiters of global finance, found themselves following rather than leading. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolised the end of Britain's position as a great power. When Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by a British-dominated company and was vital to British commerce and military strategy, Britain and France attempted to reverse the nationalisation through military force, yet the United States and the Soviet Union opposed the intervention. The United States, which held the mortgage on the British pound and could have destroyed it through financial pressure, effectively vetoed the operation. Britain was forced to withdraw from Suez, making clear to the world that Britain's days as an independent great power were over. Britain now operated within a system defined by American power, and it would do what Washington deemed acceptable. The latter half of the 20th century witnessed Britain's steady accommodation to its reduced role. It became dependent on American protection during the Cold War. Its economy, while still substantial, was no longer among the world's most dynamic. British manufacturing continued to decline as other nations' industries proved more competitive. British attempts to maintain competitiveness through devaluation of the pound only accelerated inflation and further weakened the currency. The pound sterling, which had once been backed by British gold reserves, industrial power, and commercial dominance, became a chronically weak currency that had to be defended through high interest rates and occasional capital controls. The London banking system, though still important, was increasingly populated by foreign banks conducting international business, rather than British banks dominating global finance. The process of decolonization, while economically damaging to Britain, was perhaps inevitable given the forces at play. The empires of the 19th century had been built on the assumption that Europe would continue to dominate the world through superior technology and military power. Yet the very technology that had given Europe its advantage was now spreading globally. Nationalist movements in Asia and Africa drew on European political philosophies, democracy, self-determination, socialism, to justify their demands for independence. The United States and the Soviet Union, both of which ideologically opposed colonialism, competed for influence in newly independent nations. The European colonial powers, exhausted by World War II, lacked the resources and the will to hold their empires together through force. Britain in particular, having spent its wealth and its young men fighting fascism, had neither the resources nor the moral authority to maintain colonial rule. The transformation of British power from dominance to dependence was thus not simply the result of military defeat or industrial inefficiency. Rather, it resulted from a fundamental shift in the structure of the global economy and the distribution of wealth and power. In the 19th century, when Britain had possessed industrial monopoly and naval supremacy, power had flowed naturally to Britain. The system of empire, the dominance of the pound, and the control of trade were all expressions of this underlying economic reality. As other nations industrialised and developed their own competitive capabilities, the foundation of British power eroded. Wars that drained Britain's resources, revolutions that shook the foundations of imperialism, and the rise of new economic powers in North, America and eventually Asia all contributed to the decline. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had become what might be called a middle power, a nation of considerable importance but no longer the supreme global authority. Its economy, while still substantial, had to compete with those of other developed nations. Its pound sterling, though still traded globally, was a minor currency compared to the dollar. Its influence in global affairs was real but limited, often exercised through alliance with the United States rather than through independent power. The empire, which had covered vast territories at the height of British power, had been reduced to a handful of small possessions and the sentimental attachments of the Commonwealth. The sun had set on the British Empire not in a dramatic moment of collapse, but through a slow, irreversible erosion of the economic foundations upon which that power had rested. And the world that emerged was one in which power had become diffused among multiple centres, in which economics and finance often determined outcomes as much as military force, and in which the idea that any single nation could dominate the entire world system appeared increasingly quaint and outdated.